Your dog did something today that you probably didn't notice. A small pause, a glance that lasted a second longer than usual, a quiet moment when they chose to stay near you, even when nothing was happening. Most owners think love is obvious: food in the bowl, walks every day, a soft bed, a gentle pat on the head. But behavioral research shows something surprising. Dogs don't measure love the way humans do. According to canine behavioral studies, what creates deep trust is often so subtle that most people completely overlook it. Not the big gestures, not the toys, not even the length of the walk. It's the tiny signals that tell their nervous system, you are safe here. And when those signals are missing, something invisible begins to form. Not conflict, not disobedience, just distance. Because many of the things we believe dogs enjoy, they simply tolerate. Today, we're uncovering 5 quiet moments that shape how your dog truly feels about you. Once you see them, you won't be able to unsee them. Think about the last time you touched your dog. Where did your hand go first? Most people reach for the top of the head. A quick pat? Maybe a scratch behind the ears. It feels affectionate. It looks affectionate. But here's something most owners never realize. For many dogs, that moment is not connection. It is tolerance. Behavioral research shows that dogs experience touch very differently from humans. Certain areas of their body contain clusters of pressure-sensitive nerve endings that communicate directly with the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the system responsible for calm, safety, trust. According to animal behavior research referenced by the RSPCA, slow, gentle touch around the chest, the side of the neck, and the base of the ears can measurably reduce stress signals in dogs. Heart rate softens, muscles release tension, breathing slows. Something changes in the face. The eyes become softer. The mouth loosens slightly. The body leans closer without hesitation. That leaning is not random. It is the nervous system recognizing safety. When a hand approaches from above the head, however, many dogs instinctively lower slightly or freeze. Not because they are afraid of you, because in canine body language, pressure from above can signal control. And dogs are experts at adapting to our habits. They accept the pat, they stay still, they allow the interaction to happen, but acceptance is not the same as comfort. Try something different tonight. Sit beside your dog instead of standing over them. Start at the side of the neck. Use slow circular pressure. Pause between movements. Watch the shoulders. Watch the eyes. Within seconds, you may notice a shift that feels almost invisible, but impossible to miss once you see it. That moment when their weight moves slightly toward you, when their breathing changes rhythm. That is not just affection. That is the nervous system saying, this feels safe. And safety is where trust begins. Now imagine this. Your dog steps outside and immediately lowers their head. Not looking. Reading. Because for a dog, the world is not built from images. It is built from scent. Behavioral research shows a dog's nose contains up to 300 million scent receptors, compared to about 6 million in humans. But the number itself is not the most important part. What matters is what scent allows them to perceive. Every patch of grass holds layers of information. Who passed by? How long ago? Whether they were relaxed or stressed, healthy or unwell, familiar or unknown. To us, it smells like nothing. To them, it is a story still unfolding. Yet most walks follow the same quiet pattern. A gentle pull on the leash. A soft interruption. Come on. Not because we want to rush them, because we believe the purpose of the walk is movement, exercise, distance, efficiency. But canine behavioral studies suggest something different. When dogs are given time to engage in olfactory exploration, their stress-related behaviors often decrease noticeably at home. Less restlessness, less tension, more ability to settle. Because mental fulfillment and physical fatigue are not the same experience. One drains energy, the other organizes the mind. Try one walk this week with no destination. Allow pauses without interruption. Let the leash remain loose. Let curiosity set the pace. You may notice something subtle when you return home. Not exhaustion. Balance. A dog that moves through the house more slowly. Breath steady. Eyes softer. Because they were allowed to understand their environment instead of being guided through it. Small moments like this communicate something powerful. I trust your curiosity. And trust is something dogs remember for a very long time. If you've ever wondered why some dogs seem deeply calm around certain people, this is often part of the answer. I asked you say. And then there is something even quieter, the sound of your voice. Most people believe dogs respond to words, commands, familiar phrases, their name spoken clearly across the room. But behavioral research suggests dogs are not simply listening for vocabulary, they are listening for emotional alignment. Studies using canine brain imaging at Eötvös-Loránd University found that dogs process language using two parallel systems. One part of the brain evaluates tone, another evaluates meaning, and the strongest positive response occurs only when both elements match. Warm words delivered with distracted emotion create confusion. Enthusiastic tone without emotional presence feels incomplete. But when tone and feeling move together, something remarkable happens. The brain's reward centers become active. Not because of the specific word, because of the emotional consistency behind it. Think about how often we speak while doing something else. Scrolling a screen, answering a message, preparing to leave the house. We say familiar phrases automatically. Good dog. Just a second. Wait there. The words are correct, but the emotional signal is diluted. Dogs are extremely sensitive to this difference. A brief pause before speaking can change the entire interaction. Eye contact, soft facial muscles, a tone that carries the same calm state you want them to feel. Over time, certain phrases become more than sounds. They become anchors. Signals that predict safety, signals that predict connection. This is why some dogs visibly relax when they hear their name spoken in a particular way. Not louder, not firmer, more present. When your voice consistently communicates emotional clarity, your dog no longer has to interpret mixed signals. They already understand the message. You are safe with me. Now consider one of the most predictable moments in your dog's day. Mealtime, the bowl appears. Food is placed down. Seconds later, it is gone. Efficient. Routine. Complete. But something important may be missing from that experience. Dogs did not evolve to receive food without effort. For thousands of years, survival required searching, tracking, solving small problems, using both body and mind together. That process did more than provide nutrition. It created satisfaction. Behavioral research in canine cognition suggests that when dogs are given opportunities to work for food, indicators of positive emotional state increase noticeably. More engagement, more focus, more calm behavior after eating. Because the act of solving a simple challenge activates reward pathways in the brain that a standard food bowl does not stimulate in the same way. It does not need to be complicated. Scattering kibble in the grass, placing food inside a loosely folded towel, hiding small portions in different corners of a room. The difficulty is not the point. The process is. When dogs use their nose and attention to locate food, they are completing a behavioral sequence their nervous system still expects. Search, discover, acquire. And when you are the one creating that opportunity, your presence becomes part of the reward itself. You are no longer only the provider of food. You become the provider of fulfillment. Over time, this changes how anticipation feels. Not urgency, not impatience, engagement. A quieter kind of excitement. Because satisfaction does not only come from receiving something, it often comes from participating in the process that leads to it. If this idea is new to you, try it just once this week and observe carefully. Notice the difference not only during the activity, but in the calm that often follows. Sometimes the smallest challenges create the deepest sense of stability. And now we come to something so simple that most people never think to do it intentionally. A quiet moment. No commands, no toys, no expectations, just presence. At almost every point in your dog's day, you exist above them, standing, walking past, reaching down. From a human perspective, this feels completely natural, but from a canine perspective, elevation carries meaning. In animal communication, height often signals control of space, direction of movement, predictability. Dogs adapt to this constantly. They learn to interpret footsteps, gestures, posture. They adjust their behavior in response to ours thousands of times each day. But rarely do they experience us at their level with no request attached. Try something different in a quiet part of the day. Not after a walk, not during play, not when they are asking for attention. Simply sit on the floor. No calling them. No reaching toward them. No encouraging movement. Just exist in the same space at the same height. At first, very little may happen. Your dog may glance briefly and then look away. They may remain where they are, but if you remain still long enough, something subtle often changes. Curiosity replaces uncertainty. They begin to observe you differently, without the usual cues of direction or expectation, and slowly, often quietly, they move closer. Not because they were called, not because a reward is visible, because proximity feels safe. Research in canine attachment patterns suggests that low-pressure shared proximity can strengthen secure bonding behaviors and reduce baseline anxiety responses over time. When dogs can approach voluntarily without external motivation, the interaction becomes emotionally meaningful in a different way. Choice replaces obligation. They may sit beside you. They may lie down nearby. They may simply remain present in the same space. Nothing dramatic, but something important is happening beneath the surface. Your dog is confirming that closeness with you does not always require performance. No command to follow, no behavior to earn approval, just coexistence. Moments like this quietly shape how safe your presence feels in the long term. And when a dog consistently experiences calm, predictable proximity, confidence tends to extend beyond the home into unfamiliar environments. Because safety becomes associated not with a place, but with you. If there is one practice that often changes the emotional tone of a relationship over time, it is this one. Saying everything, without asking for anything. When you look at these moments individually, they seem almost too simple to matter. A slower touch, a walk without urgency, a voice that carries the same feeling as the words, food that invites curiosity, presence that asks for nothing. None of these require special tools. None require advanced training. And yet together they shape something that cannot be created through commands alone. Trust is not built in dramatic events. It forms quietly through repeated signals that predict safety. Over time, the nervous system begins to recognize patterns. This person moves gently. This voice feels consistent. This space allows choice. And gradually, something shifts. Attention becomes softer. Recovery from stress becomes faster. Curiosity replaces hesitation. Because when an animal feels safe enough, learning becomes easier. Connection becomes natural. Many people spend years trying to build a stronger bond with their dog without realizing the bond was forming in moments they considered too small to notice. Often, the most meaningful communication is not something we say. It is something we repeat, calmly, consistently, over time. Trust rarely announces itself, but it changes everything once it is there. If one of these moments felt familiar, you were already closer to your dog than you might think. Sometimes a small adjustment changes the entire emotional direction of a relationship. I'm curious, which of these quiet signals do you think your dog responds to the most? The way you speak, the way you walk together, or simply the way you sit beside them? Let me know in the comments, because the smallest details often reveal the deepest connection.